Welcome to POTUS 2016. I'm Brian Lehrer. On the eve of Thanksgiving, terrorism is driving the presidential campaigns in the aftermath of Paris. Candidates continue to position themselves on the war against ISIS and on accepting Syrian refugees here. Let's say not all the rhetoric has been reassuring. Donald Trump confabulated an ever-changing tale of seeing hordes of Muslims in New Jersey celebrating 9/11. Dr. Ben Carson thought he saw it too until he remembered maybe he didn't. On fighting ISIS, not wanting to diss President Obama, Hillary Clinton declared in essence, "I'll bomb what he's bombing," but she says she would fight more intensely and gather better intelligence. Plus, Clinton wants a no-fly zone, which suddenly looked like a risky idea when Turkey shot down a Russian warplane the other day. All the top-tier candidates, left and right, are promising not to deploy U.S. troops to the Mideast. Senator Bernie Sanders pointed out that ISIS's rich neighbors could afford to do the job.
Saudi Arabia, turns out, has the third largest defense budget in the world. Yet instead of fighting ISIS, they have focused more on a campaign to oust Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen.
We'll hear more of Bernie Sanders' oratory later in the broadcast. And this week, Senator Marco Rubio, wanting to look like a leader who could win a war, especially for the sake of women, released this campaign video.
This is a civilizational struggle between the values of freedom and liberty and radical Islamic terror. What happened in Paris could happen here. There is no middle ground. These aren't disgruntled or disempowered people. These are radical terrorists who want to kill us because we let women drive, because we let girls go to school. I'm Marco Rubio. I approve this message because there can be no arrangement or negotiation. Either they win or we do.
By the way, Rubio is against abortion even when the life of the mother is at stake. And with all the talk of war and refugees, who's gaining and who's losing ground with voters? Yes, it's time for the horse race. First, let's look at Real Clear Politics national polling averages. They show a marked increase in support for Donald Trump over the last few days, perhaps prompted by his recent tough talk on security. Trump had started to dip slightly 10 days ago, but for now, he floats comfortably on top of the post-Paris national polls at 27.5%. Behind Trump and trailing off quickly is Ben Carson, who less than a week ago was neck and neck with the Donald nationally, sinking about 4 percentage points in a week. Carson now stands at a shaky 19.8%. Two beneficiaries of recent events were Republicans Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who've been tracking each other quite closely, just a percentage point apart. Rubio remaining slightly ahead for the last month, stands at 12.5%. Cruz, hoping to catch some of the evangelicals abandoning the Carson camp, is at 11.3%. Someone who has fared not so well is Jeb Bush. Bush's campaign continues to hover at 5% and dropped again slightly this week, perhaps due to the air being sucked out of the war room by Trump and Cruz and Rubio. On the Democratic side, the post-Paris story is similar, though not as dramatic. Hillary Clinton climbed about 1 percentage point in polling averages last week. She currently stands at a commanding 55.8% in Real Clear Politics national average. Hillary's deep background on national security and tough talk on terrorism apparently giving her a boost. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, has fallen about 3 percentage points in the polls to 30.2%, possibly underscoring security as a weakness. Finally, Martin O'Malley sees Paris a bit to inject some life into his campaign, increasing his average poll support by 1.5 points to 4.4%. Onto a different kind of data crunching, percentages of truth versus lies. The fact-checking site PolitiFact separates the facts from the fictions put out by frontrunners from both camps. With the total number of statements fact-checked on the bottom of the chart, we can see a clear difference between the parties. Bernie Sanders has been judged the most truthful in his campaign statements, notably not garnering a single completely false statement as judged by the site. He sits on top with accurate claims 73% of his factual claims time. Now to the other end of the spectrum, on the right, Ben Carson, not the bombastic Trump, collects the Booby Prize for being the least accurate in his statements on the stump. According to PolitiFact, Carson is inaccurate 82% of the time when he's making a factual statement, and not one of his statements judged was without at least some error. Continuing down the line, again starting on the left, Hillary Clinton, with the highest number of statements evaluated, 138 of them, at least partially correct 71% of the time. Bush is next, being on target 67% of the time, with Marco Rubio at 61%. Here we see the trend fall into much darker territory now, as Ted Cruz is mostly wrong or worse in 66% of his measured statements. Trump does him one better, inaccurate 3 out of every 4 times. And as we noted, Ben Carson, mostly wrong 82% of the time, in last place. But it is worth noting that PolitiFact looked at just 23 claims from Carson, very few actual statements measured. So with Donald Trump into truthiness over truth, how do we account for his widespread popularity? Well, not widespread, argues Nate Silver, founder of the data-intensive site 538. According to Silver, Trump has about 27% support among the 25% of voters who call themselves Republicans. So this only adds up to between 6 and 8% of the total electorate, which Silver dryly notes is about the same number of people who believe that the Apollo moon landing was faked. Hey, there may even be some overlap there. Stay tuned. Now let's devote some time to better understanding PolitiFact's most often truthful candidate, Bernie Sanders. Jonathan Tasini is here to be our guide, a longtime labor activist. Tasini has compiled a book of Sanders speeches entitled The Essential Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. Not only is Tasini a Sanders supporter, he knows what it's like to run against Hillary Clinton, because Tasini was her opponent on her left in Clinton's 2006 New York U.S. Senate Democratic primary. Jonathan, welcome.
It's always a pleasure to be here, Brian.
And let me play a clip of Bernie on the stump right away. This was actually his big speech at Georgetown University last week, where he explained to America, or tried to, what it means that he labels himself a democratic socialist. Here's a clip. And one thing about this clip, you know how the libertarians are always talking about freedom. See how Bernie Sanders uses it in a democratic socialist sense.
People are not free. They are not truly free when they are unable to feed their family. They are not truly free when they are unable to retire with dignity. They are not truly free when they are unemployed, underemployed, or when they are exhausted by working 60, 70 hours a week. People are not truly free when they don't know how they're going to get medical help when they or a family member are sick. So let me take this opportunity to define for you, simply and straightforwardly, what democratic socialism means to me. It means building on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said when he fought for guaranteed economic rights for all Americans. And it builds on what Martin Luther King Jr. said in 1968, when he stated, and I quote, "This country has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor," end of quote.
So, Jonathan Tasini, my question for you is, how different is Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism from being an ordinary liberal Democrat?
Well, first I want to say that I've heard Bernie speak in person on a video hundreds of times, and I never tire from hearing that because of the authenticity that comes across. And it's reflected in that PolitiFact statistic that you mentioned. He is believable, probably the only person running in the presidential candidacy that is 100% believable and authentic. And I think it's sort of a degree of difference. I think what Bernie, from a traditional liberal, is actually challenging the free market system. Many liberals, as we define them, that definition is very squishy, believe in the free market system, and they just want to kind of massage it a little bit. Bernie sees a much more fundamental failing of the system, but not providing for people.
So what would he change in terms of that? Because when I heard that speech, it struck me as he's more trying to make sure that people see him as acceptable in American context than saying, I'm going to do something really different than you're used to from your liberal Democrats in Congress. So is he not doing the same thing, essentially, that Clinton and other mainstream Democrats do, which is to say, yes, we live in capitalist America. I'm not going to have the government own the means of production and things like that. But we're going to make sure there are enough guarantees.
Far from it. You cannot be. Clinton and that group are so far from Bernie Sanders. I'll give you one example. Healthcare. Not a single Democrat running, and certainly not Hillary Clinton, is for single-payer Medicare for all, which guarantees healthcare from the time you are born till the time you die. Government-sponsored Medicare for all, which runs at a very low administrative cost. Not a single one. Everybody believes in market solutions. It's the reason that Hillary Clinton's attempt at healthcare was such an abject failure, and why I believe Obama's Obamacare, although Bernie praises it for covering more people, still does not go far enough because it leaves the insurance companies and the drug companies in control. Bernie doesn't believe that. He wants to get rid of those insurance companies.
It does help if you're going to run as a socialist in America to have a sense of humor. Watch this.
So the next time that you hear me attacked as a socialist, like tomorrow, remember this. I don't believe government should take over, the grocery store down the street or own the means of production. But I do believe that the middle class and the working families of this country who produce the wealth of this country deserve a decent standard of living, and that their incomes should go up, not down.
This is a pretty good Larry David imitation.
Very good, actually.
But a little more cheerful.
Yes. And he has a sense of humor, actually. People often think of him as this gruff guy, but if you get him in the right position, in the right place, he does have in his own way.
Going back to the first clip for a second, I think it is really interesting that even though we hear from the libertarians, Rand Paul, people like that, who are very much for the individual, that's what the libertarians stand for. Freedom, freedom, freedom. That word gets invoked all the time. Freedom to have the government off your back. Socialism, which would be for the community's interests over the individual's interests. He was also talking about freedom. Does socialism give an individual freedom?
Absolutely. And I think the contrast he was making was the comparison to saying that big corporations believe in socialism when they want to get bailouts, for example, the big banks, when they want government handouts to save industries. Then they run to the taxpayer and say, oh, we're part of we want the government to help us. When in fact, the individual, however, is left to kind of fend for themselves. And so Bernie turned it quite smartly, I think, on its head.
Let's turn to foreign affairs. And of course, the campaign seems to have changed so dramatically all around, all the candidates since the Paris attacks. For comparison, here's a clip of Hillary Clinton from her How to Fight ISIS speech on the same day as Bernie's socialism speech.
And we should be honest about the fact that to be successful, airstrikes will have to be combined with ground forces actually taking back more territory from ISIS. Like President Obama, I do not believe that we should again have 100,000 American troops in combat in the Middle East. That is just not the smart move to make here. If we've learned anything from 15 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's that local people and nations have to secure their own communities. We can help them, and we should. but we cannot substitute for them.
So Hillary Clinton last Thursday, do we have a campaign between a hawk and a dove in the Democratic race?
Well, I think you have one between someone with principles, moral principles, and someone who doesn't have principles when it comes to foreign policy. And I'll just go back to the Iraq War. If you look at Bernie's speech in 2002 opposing the Iraq War, every single thing he said came to pass, including, although he didn't mention it, including something called ISIS. He foresaw that if you fractured Iraq, something would have to take its place, and ISIS came to pass. He said, I didn't trust George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. Hillary Clinton did. She voted for the war. And to me, I think that's much more indicative of who you would trust to lead the country and who you would feel safe to lead the country.
But he also, in the debate against Clinton the other week, he brought up the Iraq War vote as the distinction between them. What I want to know, and what I'm not sure I'm hearing from Sanders, is if there's a distinction to go forward differently today. Is he really more of a dove? Is he warning, okay, ISIS is attacking the West to get the West to take the bait and come in big, which is really going to help ISIS, like the Iraq War really helped create ISIS, like you were just saying. I don't hear Sanders making that distinction about today. Am I missing it?
Well, I would say two things. One is that his basic principle is to allow for diplomacy before war. And I think that's a smart thing when you have a leader.
They all say that.
Well, what you heard from Hillary Clinton is about no-fly zones and bombing and attacking. The second thing, I think, the distinction between the two of them is Bernie Sanders is making quite clear that he thinks the Muslim nations, as the richer nations, they should really take responsibility and the onus should be on them.
They all say that,
not
too.
on the United States.
They're all talking about the ground troops should come from the Sunni Arab nations who are not doing their part, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, etc. Aren't they?
No, I think Bernie puts much more emphasis on that. I think that his instinct is not to put the United States and certainly men and women who serve in the armed forces in harm's way, and to try to push diplomacy as far as possible. And he wants to put far more onus on the Muslim nations, the Arab nations, than his opponents.
Has he taken a specific position against what we heard in the clip, which is a no-fly zone over Syria?
My memory is he's not supported that, and he's certainly not pushing for that. I think Hillary Clinton's out there on her own on that, which is a quite dangerous policy, actually.
Embedding more troops, U.S. Special Forces, with local troops and giving them more flexibility to fight, which he also proposed, which is different than President Obama, who seems to be the real dove on the stage right now.
Well, I think both of them are closer than, if you will, Hillary Clinton. Again, I think Bernie's major emphasis is, and he said it in many, many speeches, the onus must be on the nations in the region to deal with that, with the United States supporting, particularly in the diplomatic area.
All right, let's bring some evidence in on the topic of anxiety in a time of military threat. Stay with us. Time for evidence-based politics, and today we examine the uses of rhetoric in a time of anxiety. The attacks in Paris resonate with Americans, especially those who remember 9/11. Our presidential candidates have seized on that memory in different ways, too. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie had people weeping in New Hampshire as he shared his 9/11 story the other day, including not being able to reach his wife for hours after the attack. His attachment to the tragedy and his experience governing in its aftermath seem to be helping him in the polls right now. At the other end of the emotional spectrum were Donald Trump's invocations of 9/11.
I watched when the World Trade Center came tumbling down. And I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering.
Setting aside the question of whether this ever actually happened, let's watch Hillary Clinton's manner in response to Trump and Paris.
So don't get diverted by fear tactics and scaremongering and inflammatory rhetoric. This is a job we have to take on, and we have to be smart about it, and we have to be vigilant about it, and we have to make sure we protect our country and our friends.
Anxiety can motivate serious debate, But what's the effect on voters when politicians have a stake in our fears and know they can manipulate them? Bethany Albertson has studied this. She is assistant professor of political psychology at the University of Texas at Austin and co-author of Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World. Her article explaining her work recently appeared in the Monkey Cage column of the Washington Post. Dr. Albertson joins us via Skype from Austin. Hello, welcome. Hello from New York. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Can you study anxiety empirically? How do you measure in voters their anxiety levels and whether that makes them susceptible to certain kinds of pitches and policies?
It's hard. It's hard. Anxiety is a physiological reaction. It's a feeling we have. And when we try to measure things, we have difficult. So with great care, this is my first answer. But we have plenty of survey research showing, there are times when Americans feel more worried, times when they feel less worried, and differences among Americans in emotional reactions. So how we study it is we pre-test, we have a variety of experimental manipulations to provoke anxiety, and we try to manipulate emotion in a bunch of different ways to give us some confidence that it's actually anxiety doing the causal work.
Okay, so let's put up some graphics that relate to your study. This is a Gallup poll showing anxiety or worries about becoming a terrorism victim over time. You'll see that starts back in 1996, big spike there just after 9/11. Then it kind of goes up and down in a moderate range, and it's been going up again the last 3 years, not just since ISIS burst on the scene. Let's go to the next graph. After worries about becoming a terrorism victim, confidence in the government to protect citizens from terrorism, and we see that's been going gradually down since 9/11, all the way through this time period from 9/11. It never really recovered. So now we go to what policies people are more susceptible to when they're anxious about certain things. So peace through the military, for example, that upper left corner, people will be more for military spending and use of the military to maintain the peace, ironically, when they're anxious. And the other graphs on here relate to very similar measures as that. What does this tell us?
What that's telling you is that increased anxiety, and this is our argument in the book, boosts support for protective policies, those policies that are framed as protective. In that study, the graphics you just showed, what that's showing you is the difference between a group that watched just foreign policy news coverage, not emotive coverage. It was about India's economy in the control group. And in the treatment group, they were given terrorism news. So it was evocative. It had startling imagery. It suggested another terror attack was likely. Now, the difference between the treatment and control is that anxiety in the control without the terrorism news story is not related to support for, it doesn't change my acceptance of militarism or increased spending on defense or my willingness to sacrifice civil liberties to protect me from terrorism. But when exposed to threatening imagery from the news, it's that anxiety under those circumstances boosts support. So it has to be connected with some sort of elite messaging.
So can you apply that to this year's Democratic and Republican presidential candidates at all? Like Clinton, for example, who, says that something militarily needs to be done in Syria and Iraq, and who certainly acknowledges that ISIS is a real terrorist threat to Americans. Does she somehow say things that make people less susceptible to supporting military intervention than, say, a Donald Trump or a Marco Rubio?
Yeah, I think one of my hopes is the fact that she's saying things, and Rubio's saying things, and Trump's saying things, and Sanders is saying things, that we have some contestation over what's going to count as protective policy. I don't think there's an inherent link between anxiety and militarism. There's an inherent link between feeling anxious and needing protection. And if we can have a debate over what are the policies that are best able to keep us safe, particularly in the context of, a war-weary public, that maybe there's room for a different vision as opposed to just, sending more troops or, the American public's divided on some of the major questions we have today, such as what to do about Syrian refugees or, should we be committing troops? I think,
and so the less they're generating or exploiting the fear, the more people are able to live with uncertainty about what to do, rather than feeling certain that we have to take something like military action.
Well, one of the comparisons we like to make is between our current political context and 9/11. Post 9/11, you have one party offering up a set of policies and a dominant elite message about what needs to be done to keep us safe. Now, maybe the advantage of our current election is that there's a lot of contestation over what might keep us safe.
Yeah. So, Jonathan Tasini, let me bring you back in on this. Your background before being a representative of the Sanders campaign is as a labor activist. How about economic anxiety and how politicians use it?
Well, I think I was actually thinking that precise thing, and I wonder if the professor had a thought about this, because the level that when I've been traveling for the Sanders campaign, 90% of the questions are about the economy. How am I going to make a living? The banks robbing me, retirement. Not really about defense and terrorism. So I'm wondering,
even after Paris?
Even now, I was just out on the road just about when that happened, and I just came back from being in Nevada and Iowa, and I wonder if the level of anxiety is so high in economics that there's that little more that comes around terrorism. I wonder if you can separate the two. Maybe that's too hard to pull apart.
Professor, do you know? Do you have these measures relating to the economy?
We look at anxiety on the economy. It's a very different thing, though, in terms of when we're anxious about the economy, a lot of the times we blame the government for that. When we're anxious about terrorism, we look to the government to protect us. So this, is the government the source of our anxieties, or is it an outside threat where we need the government to protect us? The second thing I want to say on that is, part of our argument says when you're anxious, you need protection, and that's going to butt up against partisan politics in some interesting ways. Here we look to research by Pat Egan, for instance, who looks into issue ownership. And terrorism has been historically an issue owned by the Republican Party. So when we're anxious about terrorism, immigration also. These are issues where Americans, by and large, trust the Republican Party more. The economy, the environment, these are Democrat-owned issues. So
last word, how does Bernie Sanders fit into this equation?
Well, I think he has responded. The reason he surged so quickly and is dominating the conversation, the Democratic Party. Let's face it, Hillary Clinton has moved all her positions to match his, particularly on the economy, is he's tapped into that anxiety in the economy.
Thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that's POTUS 2016 for this week. We're here each week at this hour covering the presidential horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Next time, a journalist who knows campaigns from the inside out, Joe Klein, maybe best known as author of Primary Colors. Have a peaceful and a grateful Thanksgiving. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.